Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll make a start if you would like to take your seats. So, Feskamar Ahuladunya, Falcha Kaiv. Delighted to welcome you all tonight. And I'll introduce our speaker, Jim Wilkie, over here in just a moment. But first of all, thank you for coming and waiting while the Book Trust AGM, a much less exciting event than what we have in store for you all now, was taking place upstairs. But we finished it quite efficiently within half an hour. I hope you've had cups of tea and refreshments, and even had a chance to look at some of the Book Trust books that are on the table over there. So it's a great privilege for me to introduce Jim Wilkie. Jim, up here anyway, I think is best known for the book that he wrote, a real landmark book in 1987 about the Metagama. And of course we are now within a day of the centenary of the sailing of that boat from Stornoway on the 21st of April 1923. Jim will fill in quite a bit of the background, not just to the Metagama itself, but to the conditions in Lewis at the time that drove that fairly traumatic episode in the history of Lewis and history of emigration. I mean, suffice to say that at that time, just after the end of the First World War, the population of Lewis was roughly double what it is today. There was a huge amount of overcrowding in the crofting settlements, the ones that hadn't been cleared. People were packed into the remaining townships. Lord Leverhulme's plans for Lewis had failed. He had given up on Lewis and was concentrating on Harris by that time. So I think all of that was background to the factors that drove so many people to leave Lewis and go to Canada. So Jim is going to talk for, I think, about 45 minutes, and there'll be an opportunity for questions afterwards. And I should have said at the start that we are live streaming this event. So Jack at the back there is filming and recording the whole event, and I believe there are people joining us from all over the world, including from Canada. I think there are, with us now, remotely, descendants of people who travelled on the Metagama 100 years ago. So they are very welcome to join us as well. Welcome to everyone. Could I ask you please to welcome our speaker, Jim Wilkie.
Well, thanks very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for turning out this evening. Beautiful evening. Thanks to John for his organisation and to Jack for the sound. Jack was telling me that Lewis gets weather like this on a year-round basis. So I'm thinking of overwintering in Lewis next year. When the book came out in 1987, a reviewer said it was a useful footnote to the Highland clearances, and I thought, that's good enough for me. But of course it was something far more than a footnote to the people involved and their families. It was a life-changing event, and for the community a kind of important building block for the folk memory, which is so important to us all. I came to Lewis first in the early 1970s. I'd been a student with Brian Wilson, and we were co-founders of the West Highland Free Press, so I would come here either on paper business, or we used to promote music to help pay for the paper, and I came with a Corey's folk group a few times. I was in Lewis a number of times in the 70s and met my wife in 1979. She came from Holland, Lorna Gillespie. Her father was Archie Gillespie, the agriculturalist, and her mother was Norma Montgomery from Laxdale. And Norma's family had come from Tongue over generations. And in 1983, Lorna took me to meet her grandmother in Newmarket. And I didn't know much about her, but Lorna told me that she'd also mentioned my daughter's living and working in Lewis now too, Jasmine. But my wife told me that her grandmother was one of 8 sisters, and all of them had emigrated to America at some time or other. Some had stayed in America, 1 or 2 died in America. And this interested me, and we had actually their story, the family story was not untypical in a way, but amazing in another way, which you know, was the sort of experience of so many Leosics. The first sister, the oldest sister in the family, Kate, had gone to New York in 1907, and she had managed to land a job with a socialite family, the husband of whom was a man called Monroe Robinson, and he was a descendant of James Monroe, a former US president, and the lady of the house was a sister of former President Teddy Roosevelt. So Kate was obviously well placed to help her sisters through kind of chain migration, which was so common, paying for the next one and so forth, common in Scotland and Ireland. And one by one, all the sisters came to work in New York, and Kate also arranged for a couple of cousins to go over, and one of these cousins became the mother of Donald Trump. So I didn't learn all this information at that meeting, but I said to her, "What about your husband? Did he emigrate?" And she said, "No, he'd been abroad in the First World War, but he didn't emigrate. But his brother was a famous piper," she said at the time, a guy called Monty Montgomery. She said he went on the emigrant ship, the Metagama. So I thought, the Metagama, a fantastic name. I'd heard the name, but I didn't really know anything about it. And she said, yeah, it sailed in 1923. And I must have just stored this fact away. Now, seems a bit of a digression, but I was a kind of professional mongrel. Apart from the paper, I was working in music then, and I had begun to write the first book, which was about football, professional football in Dundee. And a friend, a broadcaster called Billy Kay, had become a Dundee United fan. I come originally from Dundee. And there are 2 football teams in Dundee. Why? They play across the road from one another. Why? Limited sectarianism. Why? No one had written a history of professional football. So I mentioned this to Billy, and he mentioned it to a young Edinburgh publishing firm called Mainstream, one of the directors was Gordon Brown at the time. And they were a bit sceptical. They produced sort of worthy little academic books like Hugh McDermott's Aesthetics in Scotland, and they'd sell about 50 copies. Didn't know about a football book, but lo and behold, and they produced it fairly cheaply, I have to say, but lo and behold, 4,000 copies sold before Christmas. Didn't make my fortune, but it opened their eyes to the possibility of sports publishing. And if I tell you that their next sports author was a man called Alex Ferguson, and then Ali McCoist, you get the picture. They moved into kind of bigger money. So that enabled me to think about another book. And 1923 was an important year in Dundee football. Dundee FC were the kind of Scottish team, and a team called Dundee Hibs came from the local Irish community. But because of the Irish troubles of the time, Irishness was less popular, and Dundee Hibs were going to change their name to Dundee United. And the only Scottish paper which paid any attention to this in any detail, the kind of cultural implications of it, was the People's Journal. And the People's Journal, in my lifetime, it was a good local paper, but it was a sort of couthy parish pump type paper. It was a D.C. Thompson paper, but it was actually founded by a guy called John Laing, who had been a Liberal and a friend of Gladstone, therefore interested in the Irish land question and the Highland land question. So his paper paid attention to events in the Highlands. And as I was turning from the sports pages, I turned this big double-page article, Metagama sales for Canada. I thought, wow, that's a much bigger event, media event than I'd anticipated. Great photographs of movie cameramen, news movie cameramen. But the one that caught my eye was a small one of a piper. It said, the Lewis Piper, Monty Montgomery. So this was a relative of my wife. And I thought, goodness, I've got a story here. So I began to follow up letters. I put a letter in the Gazette and one in the Free Press, and immediately got loads of response. A man wrote to me from Bridge of Dawn in Aberdeenshire, a 20-page letter, loads of contacts, a travel agent, should I wish to go over, who knew loads of Lewis people. So immediately I had a number of contacts. But I realised quite early that there were very few Metagama people still alive. In the end, I spoke to 3 personally who lived in the East. Well, a couple were on the East Coast. One had come back to Lewis. One lived in California, too far. One was in Vancouver, too far. And one was in Wisconsin. And this man died in correspondence. So I kind of realised that I'd have to be quick if I was going to be able to speak to survivors. And I also took a decision that I'd kind of speak to 1 or 2 other people who emigrated around that time or come back to Lewis or whatever. So I eventually did go over myself in 1986. Now, I don't want to give you too much factual information about emigration because many people here know a lot more about it than I do for a start. But it was kind of relevant. So if I can just kind of skim through, I used a line that there was never a time when the Gael was a stranger to emigration. And things picked up in the 18th century because of events like the Jacobite Rebellion, catastrophe for Gaelic culture, the 7 Years' War, where Britain got land from France and Canada and America, the American War of Independence. So the Americas seemed a more kind of promising place for people, and the middle classes, tacksmen and so forth, they began to go over. The British government was slightly concerned about the drift, but the Napoleonic War, the whole Napoleonic period, put an end to that immigration, and it also boosted the economy of Lewis, the kelp industry and so forth. At the end of the war, the kelp industry collapsed, and this coincided with the advent or the growth of sheep farming and the appalling clearances. Lewis people suffered very badly at this time. James Matheson bought the island in 1844. He, you will know probably, had been he was supposed to be an East India trader, but in fact he sold Indian opium to the Chinese. And when the Chinese said they didn't want to buy opium, he organised a parliamentary lobby in Britain to send gunboats to China and eventually fight small wars in order to force the Chinese to take opium. And this made a fortune for him. He bought Lewis, he made some improvements in the town and the castle and the harbour and so forth. He got a fairly good press from historians. Matheson, even quite recently, people, in the 80s and 90s, were saying he was a good laird and so forth. But he may have been, but he was also engaged in encouraging people to go. And one of his factors, Donald Munro, you'll know, was a notorious character in the clearances. There was a Lewis fight back, the land raiders, there was a fight back generally in the Highlands, and this led to the Crofters Commission and the Crofters Act, which is a very important event that gave security of tenure to the Crofters in the Highlands. As a result, things began to settle down a bit in terms of immigration. The government began to quantify what the problem was. I mean, they knew what it was. They said not enough land for too many people. Of course, there was enough good land, but it just wasn't distributed very well. But anyway, so they were making efforts, and people were hearing that there was going to be something happening, but the First World War intervened. Calamitous for the young men of Lewis, the Isle Air disaster, and Leverhume's schemes collapsing. So by the 1920s, Lewis was obviously in a state of economic and emotional depression. Because the families had security of tenure, there had been great poverty still at the turn of the century, before the war and after the war. But I think the young men and women were beginning to think that there may be, there was something to look towards in the future apart from the croft, because the croft was, their parents were secure and so forth. And the British government began to change the nature of the game, change the spin, if you like. They they passed an Empire Settlement Act and an Overseas Development Committee. After the war, they began to think, well, instead of us trying to solve the land question in Scotland, we can maybe encourage them to emigrate by saying, you are important to the future of the colonies, and this meant that the British government, would not be responsible for the immigration. And the government of Ontario picked up on this. Canada had its problems as well, because they were losing young men after the First World War to the car factories in the American cities. And because of this crisis, the Ontario elected a farmers' party in 1922, and they saw the British initiative, and they thought, now if we team up with Canadian Pacific, we can put a deal together whereby a subsidised arrangement will be made for labour if we can find it in the UK. Canada had also anticipated immigration and had built the two ships, Metagama and Missinaba. And the Ontario government, they sent a man over, a guy called Major Goodliff, to try and see what he could find in Britain. And he travelled throughout Britain. I saw a report of a meeting in Norfolk and one in Lancashire, but he seemed to find what he was looking for in Lewis. Big people, he said, with agricultural and fishing experience, and enough young women to go as domestic servants. And once again, the British government, had a kind of slightly dubious role. There were reports saying we should encourage advertisements in the newspapers, so that it looked like it was a commercial opportunity that Canada was beckoning, and they weren't being pushed out. So Goodliff came to Lewis. I'm not sure if he gave he had a sort of magic lantern, a cinematograph, and he showed a little film in Lionel and in Point and in Stornoway and in Barvas, I think. I'm just not sure if he came to Lochs. But a lot of people, I think 16 people came from Lochs eventually. So this suggests that there probably was a presentation here. And whereas in Uig, where I was last night, there were only three men left from Uig, and there was no presentation over there. So, the selling had been done in different communities. One man said they showed us the glories of Canada, but not the snow, the Tal Four. And they were obviously taken by it. One of the immigrants said his father had gone to war, and he had to look after the croft and his young brothers and sisters from when he was 12 years old, so he didn't want any more crofting. He saw it as a good opportunity, and one or two others said the same thing, although they also held to the Gaelic culture and their home. So the The arrangements were made. Goodliff he put adverts in the paper saying there were 300 names. The figures vary. Newspapers said different numbers from the shipping list, but the shipping list said 260, including 18 women and 11 from Uist. It was a sort of a time. It was a time of uncertainty. Obviously, the ship was to go on 100 years ago tomorrow, the 21st of April. The Marlock, another ship, had been in Barra earlier in the month, taking families over. But the Metagama seemed to be the one that captured the attention. It captured the attention of the media, as I had said. There was obviously excitement in the town. Everybody could remember there was entertainment, there were religious services. The Scottish press said these young people shouldn't be judged. It's an opportunity for them. And they said the scenes on the roads resembled refugees the night before. They were refugees of a sort. They weren't fleeing violence, but they were fleeing circumstance. And there were a few cars at that time, even a few buses, and all the emigrants could always remember the build-up here. The Metagama could actually take about 1,500 people. So it's not often remembered that 1,000 or so boarded in Glasgow. And curiously, the Canadian papers and so forth didn't pay much attention. They focused on the Hebrideans. It must have been because of the reputation of the Hebrideans and Highlanders as adaptable, resilient emigrants. It sailed from Glasgow, berthed in the Minch, and the Hebrides of the time was the little tender. Huge crowd on the harbour. The hardcover book has them round the harbour. I don't know what numbers there. I would think a couple of thousand maybe. Pipe band played, the Lewis pipe band. Gaelic psalm singing. So a very poignant day. And the dignitaries went on to the ship to inspect it, and they were travelling third class effectively, but there were no major complaints about that, either from the dignitaries or from the emigrants. The boat sailed in the afternoon, went round the northern shore, and the bonfires were lit apparently. One remembered one in Ness at St. Ronan's Temple in Europe. And one of the emigrants, a man from Ness, he'd been in the Naval Reserve, and he and his pals had learned Morse code from torches. And he said as the boat came round the butt, he saw the torches flashing, and it was saying, what ship, what ship? And he said a few years later, he spoke to a friend and he said, I saw the torches. Did the ship reply? And he said, it said, I get emotional, SS Metagama and goodbye. So it was, that was the end of the first act, as it were. The sailing itself was uneventful, largely uneventful, a lot of seasickness apparently. And the ship was supposed to sail to Montreal, but it was diverted to, there was ice in the St. Lawrence, and the ship was diverted to St. John, New Brunswick, which was a kind of deep water port, a bit like Grimsby or something, I think. And they were met there by the dignitaries, by politicians who had got through, although there was also severe flooding. And they were kind of trapped in St. John for a few days until the trains could get through. And the Canadian press were there, and the Toronto Star and the other papers were, gave it a huge build-up, but it was a very strange type of build-up. It said, Hebrideans, a race of giants are coming here. When they eventually arrived, they said, actually they're just about the same size as the rest of us. They said, descendants of the legendary Saint Columbia, patron saint of motion pictures. And one of the photographs that I liked said, Wick, a small town not far from Stornoway. And sure enough, you know, they were filmed, and they then boarded the trains and went to Montreal. And some of the immigrants, they said when they saw the farms, they thought, wow, this is nothing like crofting, you know, and they immediately had their eye on the lakes. They thought they'd go fishing. But anyway, they went to Montreal. They were greeted by T.B. Macaulay, whose father was, his grandfather was a Lewisman, and his father had founded Sun Life Assurance of Canada, and now a global insurance company. And T.B. Macaulay was the president at the time. So he welcomed them and said if they worked hard and saved money, they'd be made in Canada. From Montreal, they went to Toronto. They were met by other Lewis people, and some said that they hadn't been properly fed on the trains and so forth, but they did get a meal in Toronto. Some remembered exactly what they got, 2 pork chops and this kind of thing. And then they found out that Ben would be taken out into the countryside and left at a crossroads often and said, you know, your farmer should turn up later, and they did in the main. And the women went to work in the private houses. So this was where the kind of new adventure was about to start, and a new round of hard times from what I can glean. I went over in 1986. I got a little bit of support from the Arts Council, which probably wouldn't be available today, and the Highland Fund. And I flew to Halifax, where again the Highland connection. I had been given the name of an architect who came from Portree, a young man, David Forsyth, stayed with him. Then went on to St. John, New Brunswick, where I had the name of a Lewis woman who was she was a later immigrant, but she had married a Canadian man who was growing up in New Brunswick at the time, and he remembered the what he called the year of the freshet, the heavy floods that had blocked the trains. And so that set me going, and I then went on to Montreal, and the first person I spoke to wasn't a Metagama man. He's a guy called Murdo McLean, who was a T.B. Macaulay boy. He was a bit younger than the Metagama people, had been in the army after the war, and had left it very bitter because the employment offered to him was he could be a coal miner or a prison officer, which he thought was rather poor. So he was keen to get out, and he happened to meet a teacher from the Nicholson who said T.B. Macaulay ran annual or biannual tests for bright kids, mathematicians usually, who would go to work in the insurance company. And this guy, Murdo McLean, passed the test and sailed out from Liverpool and said never regretted it. He was about 80 at the time, and played the squeeze box, I remember, and that was kind of setting me on my way. I then went to Ottawa, which was the federal capital, great libraries, and also a film archive. And I was looking through the catalogue, and one said, Farmers' Party welcomes immigrants 1924. And I thought, or 25 it maybe said, and I thought, that's not right, because the Farmers' Party was out of power by then. And so I said, can I have a look at this? And it was 2 minutes of absolutely pristine film, like Hollywood film. Slightly sepia, but good quality. And sure enough, it was the Metagama. And the politicians were there, T.B. Macaulay. And Ken Macquarie, who was at BBC Gaelic TV at the time, he actually bought the rights for it and showed it as a prospect programme with commentary by Callum Ferguson. And it was a very interesting thing to see, I thought. Ottawa, and then on to Toronto. And I started having my own kind of personal adventure when I was in Ottawa. Ottawa is a kind of political town where people commute and then go home, but the politicians, as in Britain, kind of hang about the hotels. And this guy who'd had a few drinks came up to me in a hotel bar and said, "You Scottish?" And I said, "Yeah." "What was I doing there?" And I said, "Oh, writing a book about immigrants." And his second sentence was, "You one of those Scottish communists?" What? So I then, my own cousin from Dundee lived in Toronto, so I was in her local library, another good library, and I said, is there a cafe in the library? And the woman said, "No, sir, but there's a bar." I must have had that look of a Scottish communist. So I went down, and it was full of Rangers supporters in the strips and everything. So that was Toronto. And then finally, when I went to Detroit to meet the first Metagama man, I got a Greyhound bus and arrived at the bus station. I was looking for this suburb called Livonia. And a little guy came up to me with a newspaper under his arm. And he said, "Can I help you, sir?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm trying to get to Livonia." And he said, "Livonia? I don't know where that is, but would you like to buy some grass?" I said, "Of course not. How much is it?" No. No. So that was me there. And there in Livonia, I met the first man, Donald Tulloch MacLeod, from Knockard in Ness, and his wife Annie, who came from Skiggerston, also in Ness. Now he was he was an older man, but he was a big, impressive guy. And he had worked on a farm to begin with, and said it was good, interesting work, and he got paid, which not everyone did. And he met his first kind of black colleagues at that time, got on well with them. And he told a funny story about how the community he lived in had been a Puritan, he described it as a Puritan community, and they were to vote on the restoration or abolition of prohibition. So this is complicated, but they were voting on whether the community should drink again. And he said the entire community voted against it, except one. And they all thought it was him, He said it wasn't me, Scottish communist. No. So he worked there for a few months, but they were hearing there was more money available in America. And he managed to just cross over the border and eventually got papers without difficulty. But not everyone did. But he then, I think he was fishing for a while, and then he went to New York where he met his wife. And finally went back to Detroit, where he worked in General Motors, and he kind of described going into these massive car factories for the first time. And he said that Detroit was a really nice place then, and he'd enjoyed living there, although there had been riots. My impression was the city centre was intact in the 1980s, but when you got to the first ring of suburbs, wow, a lot of burned out houses and abandoned properties. This was the Ronald Reagan economic miracle, of the time. But Donald and his wife liked Detroit, and he said he had never been frightened to go into the city, and even at his advanced age, he was still going. From Detroit, I went to New York, I think. I'd planned to go to Cleveland because I'd seen a photograph of the Cleveland Lewis Society. Most of the cities, the northern cities, had Lewis societies, big societies, 300, 400 members, and there was one such in Cleveland, but I didn't have any contact there, so I just kind of went through the town, went to New York. Another little escapade, I travelled overnight and went into the Greyhound station to change my clothes in the toilet in the morning. Here is there a guy starting to wreck the place, pull the cubicles apart and bawling and shit. Oh, God. So I quickly dressed, made an excuse and left, and on to Long Island, where I met another great character, Broxy Mackenzie. He came from Habost, and again, tall, good-looking man who remembered the poverty of his youth. He'd been born at the turn of the century, and he said, there was terrible poverty. He had come from a big family, but he only remembered 2 of his sisters because all the other children had died young. And he remembered an occasion where a doctor came to the house, and the child was parched with whatever illness he had, and was licking the doctor's oilskin. to get water. So a hard time. And he worked on the Leverhulme Road as a young man. He got 4p an hour. And Donald Tulloch from Detroit, he also worked on the Leverhulme, the Ness Road. And he remembered a delegation going from Ness to Barvas to speak to the land raiders and say, stop this land, we have jobs to protect. Anyway, it didn't work. But so Broxie was there at that time too. And he signed up for the Metagama. He remembered the boarding charge was £4 and the crossing was £16 to be repaid to the Canadian government. Some people repaid it, some didn't. And a neighbour had said to him, he didn't have the £4. She said, if you look after my sheep, I'll give you the £4 to board the Metagama. So he dutifully looked after the sheep and went to, and she said, no, I'm sorry, I don't have the money. So he then had to go to the shipping agent, say he couldn't make it. And the shipping agent, rather vindictively, wouldn't let him on the Marloch, the next ship either. And he eventually got away on the SS Canada. He had a completely different experience. In that, whereas some crossed the border with ease, with a British passport, or ex-servicemen, or variously, or paid money sometimes, Broxie, when he tried to get across, he was always getting stopped by the bureaucracy. He worked in the farms for a while. He then went to the New York tunnels, I think, and he linked up with a Lewis Society in Buffalo. And one of the reasons there was a big group in a coherent group in Buffalo was that a Lewis family ran a boarding house, a family called McKeever. The father had been in the Lewis pipe band, and they welcomed young men from Lewis, and they all remembered going there for tea and sometimes staying there and so forth. So he went to Buffalo, and the people in Buffalo said, all you've got to do is go back into Canada, you go to this certain doctor and he'll give you a visa. He went back into Canada, and the doctor said, what have you been doing working on farms? He said, show me your hands. And of course, Broxie had not really been working much on farms. He said, no calluses, no visa. So Broxie then became a bricklayer in the winter, and he said, and this company failed to pay him. He said it was the middle of winter, he had one suit of clothes, the suit he'd got out, and the boss said, I'll give you my coat for the winter. So, they were dealing with very difficult circumstances. When I went to his house in Long Island, he said, yeah, I'll give you an interview, but I'm watching the hockey match. He had a kind of curious mixture of an American and Lewis accent, and so I had to go in and watch the ice hockey to begin with. And at the end, he gave me this absolute nugget of information. I said, what did you do social? And he said, well, on a Saturday night, all the Lewis people and a lot of the Highland societies went to a hall in Harlem for the dancing. My goodness. And he said, we had a Lewis society there which occasionally welcomed visiting ministers. And we realized we could get this hall cheaply because we had some religious meetings. So we started running dances, and so we were getting 300, 400 people on a Saturday night. When I found this place, the hall was still standing. It wasn't just in Harlem, it was in central Harlem. It was on the corner of 125th Street, where the Black Apollo Theatre is, where the jazz clubs were. Duke Ellington's playing there, and the Lovesicks are all dancing at the end of the road. So it was an interesting time. He said, there was interaction with the black community, but not much social interaction. So then to Buffalo, and another fine man, Angus MacDonald, who was one of the oldest of the immigrants. And he was a real character. He came from Ness too, and his relatives he'd had relatives who'd gone out earlier, but they were in Vancouver, and he didn't want to go that far west. He kind of knew what he was doing, didn't like the look of the farms, went straight to he didn't go to the lakes, he went to Niagara Falls first. And he said, it was a huge project. And the man said, you see that cliff there? You'll be working on that cliff. Would that be okay? He said, I used to get eggs in much more difficult places than that in Lewis. So he said he was a bit of a show-off. And once he was offered a job as an iron rigger, and the tower blocks and the skyscrapers, he said he could have done it, but because he was a show-off, he probably would have been injured or something. Anyway, again, the adaptability, he goes from Niagara to the lakes, and he hears there's a job in Seattle, which is on the other side of the country. Away he goes to Seattle and starts sailing ships to Alaska. At the end of the war, actually, the first... He was a young man, but he did have service at the end of the war. Fishing boats had become minesweepers in the channel, and they were being decommissioned. And his job as quite a young man was to help crew the fishing boats going back, sometimes to Lewis, but all around the northeast. He said we went up to Cape Wrath. Pretty responsible job for a young man. So he went to Seattle, shipped the salmon, came back to New York via the Panama Canal and bought a new suit for New York. And when he got to his locker, somebody had stolen it. So he had to go into New York in his overalls and buy a second-hand suit and go to Buffalo and New York and then back to Buffalo in the second-hand suit. And he had stayed in Buffalo. And it was this McKeever family who made the contact for me. And Anne McKeever, the daughter, she came to visit me in my home in Dollar some years later, so that was very nice. Back then to Toronto, I met the only lady I interviewed, who was called Mary McFarlane McKeever. She had not been on the Metagama, but her brother had. And her brother had been noted in the newspapers as a very young-looking boy who could not have even been 18. And she said, no, Murdo McFarlane, he was only about 16 at the time. They had been orphaned as children and went to live with a cousin, or family of cousins in Melbourne. And one of the cousins was Murdo McFarlane, the Melbourne Bard. So there's confusion, and Murdo the Bard, he also emigrated at some point. But Murdo the brother, he went in the Metagama, he stayed for 10 years, and his sister followed. She worked in the house, she said, very nice people. She'd never seen an electric light switch before. She said, she had to work fairly hard, but there were some labour-saving devices. I don't know if they would have had washing machines at that time, but she enjoyed it. And the first Sunday she went to the Free Church of Toronto, she met a man from Point, and they said, I knew your cousin, and they married. And most of the male immigrants did marry women from Lewis. And made their life in Toronto, and she said she enjoyed it very much. Her family had grown up there. The only comment was when she went back to Scotland, and she had never been on the mainland of Scotland, neither. Donald Tulloch, he had never been there either. But she said the one thing she noticed was that elderly people in Lewis were looked after better than in Canada, probably had to pay for their care or something. So that was the Canadian side, if you like, from my point of view. And it was very lucky, it was just a kind of lucky chance. I was able to catch 2 or 3 of the survivors. Came back to Lewis, there was a man who had come back, Innes of Bragar, he was called, and Angus MacDonald from Bragar. And I was hearing earlier he had a connection. I think he was a church presenter. And I remember, when I heard this, I remembered he had a really resonant speaking voice. And his wife had an interesting story. She had come from Tongue, and her brother had been on the Metagama. She wasn't. And when Angus and his wife came back to Lewis, she was homesick for Toronto because the brother and her sister, I think, were buried in Toronto. So that's the confusion. That's the kind of emotional confusion that the immigrants suffered. What did I learn? Excuse me. I'm not saying this to flatter people, but I learned that Lewis folk were quite exceptional people, resilient, as I said, adaptable, kind of. Unfortunately, they were lost to the island. The island was weakened by their loss. The language was weakened. The culture was weakened. But in a way, the knowledge that their sons and daughters could go anywhere in the world and succeed, do useful things, I suppose, was important. And I think this gave Lewis people a resolve, that would help them tackle kind of future challenges. And there are plenty of them. So, if you will indulge me, I'll just finish up with something on the musical tradition you'll be delighted to hear. There were a number of songs which grew up from the Metagama and from Emigration at that time generally. One I liked was Elen Big Down na Chuain. So, the lava carriage do Elen na Chuain, Sag jalach o cruai is traum, An baas na chave criska as a buain, Gundunyan is suas and coal, An oi grisken je loch alles na coal, An atchen a loich of haun, Hagen vanich gen vroik, a shul and ruin, An elen and ruik a towel. So hier your riri tokishin found, elen back down a chuain, elen back loes dachin and shorge, a chumas and chor a suas, elen and town a gavik na soins a chuchich and rein gebuai, o collery kele tokishin found, elen back down a chuain. Thanks very much. Questions?
Well, thank you very much. And I'm really glad we had all that recorded, including the songs.
I'm sorry, it's pretty factually dense. I'm sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. I mean, I think to me that the human stories, came out of I think, a lot of us know about the statistics, we trade in statistics, but putting the human story to it gives a whole new dimension. And it came out to me that we read a lot about the people who emigrated at the time of the clearances. And, they had very challenging times too, but emigration was taking place, nearly 100 years later, and the same different challenges were met. So I'd like to come near the microphone. Does people have any questions for Jim? Now's your opportunity. Who would like to talk?
Jim, thanks. Thanks, Jim, for that. Thanks. I think it's the first time ever. Thank you for the book. It's a much fun book in our house. Our grandparents left on the Metagama. And thanks for reminding us that you have a future as a presenter as well in the show.
I'm a good friend of Callum Martin, so he'd better look out.
As I said, it's a much fun book in our house and was unavailable in the run-up to the anniversary. People couldn't get a hold of it, so I wondered if there were plans for a reprint or an update.
I suggested that to the paperback printer, but said it was too expensive for a short print.
And also my other question was about Metagama itself. It says in the book that Metagama means the confluence of two rivers, the meeting of two rivers. I've only ever seen that reference in your own book. I guess I wouldn't see it anywhere else. I just wondered where you got that from.
Oh, well, it's difficult to remember after all, but I didn't make anything up. Probably, I don't know, one of the Canadian publications. I can't really remember, but I was interested in Metagama and Missinabie were railway stations in northern Ontario. So, and Indian names obviously, but I did somewhere Street, it was an Algonquin word, which meant where the rivers meet.
Beautiful.
So, but I can't really.
Anyone else? Please? Well, I'll ask you a question. I've actually asked it before. I know the answer now, but several people have asked me, did anyone from Paris go on the
No Harris listing in the. I didn't make a comprehensive note, but I just really checked from the areas that I was speaking in. 3 people from Uig, 16 from Lochs, 28 from Ness, and I think similarly big numbers from Stornoway, the west side and Point. They were the principal. 260, including 18 women, 11 from Euston. It said somewhere 1 family from Gairloch, but there was no family. It was all single men. I don't know. And this maybe accounted for the discrepancy in figures where the paper said one thing and the shipping list said another. I was also I was pulled up by James Shaw Grant at the time that the shipping agent in Stornoway was called Murdo McLean, and his nickname was Murichi Voch or something like that, Murdo of the poor, and he had this nickname. I said to someone, why did he have that nickname? And he said, well, because he was also the Poor Law Commissioner or something. And I thought, that's a dubious link to be the man responsible for the poor law and for the emigration. But James Shaw Grant said, no, it was his father who was the poor law officer, and he was just the shipping agent. James Shaw Grant also had a funny story that 1 man, out of everyone who went through the customs shed, 1 man was rejected. And he was a tall, gaunt figure who showed signs of TB. And when he came out the back door, people said, why were you rejected? And he said, too tall. So Shaw Grant said, too tall for Canada. Quite good. But no one from Harris is mentioned.
And do you think that was because Lord Leverhume's projects were still
Could have been.
going on then?
Could have been. And there's also a thing, a man spoke to me yesterday who said his people came from Reef in Uig. And, there was some in Reef. And he said, at that time I didn't remember that I had a note of that. And he said, of course, some of them used Stornoway addresses, places that they would be leaving from or something. So it's conceivable that someone from Harris used a Lewis address. I didn't hear.
We've got a few Heralds in the audience.
I think the reason is because we were too tall and we were not handsome enough.
Okay, anything else?
Well, thanks everybody anyway for coming out again, and I hope you continue to enjoy this.
Let me then just draw the formal part of the meeting to a close, and there will be an opportunity afterwards to collar Jim and ask him things. I'm not sure if there's any refreshments left on the table over there. But anyway, I've got a number of people to thank before I come to Jim himself. First of all, this is an Islands Book Trust event, and there are leaflets all about us on the table over there, so do take one. If you're not a member, come and join us. This is the sort of thing we love doing, trying to get people from different walks of life, different backgrounds all together so we can learn from each other. And I think this has been a perfect example of how Jim, with his research that he's done, is fortunate enough to actually be able to talk to some of the people who were on the Metagama. He has come here. There are people in the audience who know a lot about the Metagama, a lot more than I do about the Metagama. But there are other people who I know have just arrived on the island and hadn't even heard of the name Metagama, I think, until very recently. So, I think we do learn from each other. That's what the Book Trust tries to do. I'd like to thank Kinloch Historical Society, Ken Roddy in particular, for use of the venue, which is superb. And I know Ken Roddy has put a lot of effort into just getting the place set up properly. So many, many thanks to Kinloch Historical Society, to the Collier for support, in fact some financial support from the Homecoming Fund, and also the Multimedia Unit, who were responsible for the live streaming, although Jack at the back there actually did the live streaming, so thank you, Jack, for that. To Ishbel McLennan, I can't quite see her here, if she's still here, but Ishbel took on the job of the catering, so many, many thanks to Ishbel and to all the people who helped her and have come from Park and Kinloch, I think, to serve the teas and help with the book sales. Thank you very much to all of the helpers. Everyone who's come in person and those that are still online, I hope, and I hope you've all enjoyed this event. But most of all our thanks, I think, go to Jim for his evocative presentation, particularly the song, which I hope is going to be preserved for posterity. We have recorded the event. We will be putting it on a website so that it'll be a permanent record of this evening. So could we all join with me in thanking Jim for his brilliant presentation?